Right, good morning, friends. In the absence of Ray Bray, who normally introduces our discussion group, um, this morning I'm going to be doing one of these series of interviews of various other friends that we've been running. And this morning I'm going to be talking to Judi Brill from Horfield Meeting, and I've got various questions that I should like to put to her. But when she and I have finished with these, please do come forward with any other questions which you have come up with during the meeting. And I'm sure Judy will be very pleased, maybe very pleased to answer them. Okay, thank you. Um, okay, Judy, am I right in thinking it was Devon that you were growing up in the post-war years?
Yes, I was actually born in Tottenham, but we moved to Devon the day before I was 5. And I saw the first wild daffodils the next day growing in Devon. And I lived there until I was 18.
That must have been quite a contrast well, of course you were small, like 5 years old, but still, when you moved.
I don't remember an awful lot prior to going to Devon, but I do remember very clearly, because they were new experiences, I guess. I remember very clearly quite a lot of times after that being 5 and living, first of all, in a cottage that had no running water, no electricity, a large orchard, and I don't know what's the collective noun for pigs. We had a herd of pigs in the orchard, and it was pretty muddy and scruffy, really, and a sunny lav in the garage. And that was my introduction to living in Devon. We did move up the social scale fairly quickly after that, because my dad had gone down to be the first children's officer for Devon following the end of following the new act after the Poor Law to deal with children in care. So we lived in a number of different, what were called staff houses by our posh neighbour. And they were actually council houses that were only available to staff, Devon County Council staff. So that's why they were called staff houses, but they were council houses. And I was lucky enough to live in Topsham, which is a very, very beautiful village. And later on in Pennsylvania, in Exeter, which is so cool because one of the Barclays built a beautiful Georgian crescent at the top of the hill overlooking Exeter, and that was called Pennsylvania Crescent. And our council house was a few roads down, up down the slope. But it was there that Christopher Holdsworth lived, in one of the very posh apartments in Pennsylvania Crescent. And a childhood friend of mine also lived as an adult in the flat next door. And Christopher and I had a lot of fun because my friend was called George Fox. So whenever I saw Christopher, I'd say, "And how's George Fox?" And he'd say, "Doing rather better, thank you." And George was the youngest son of Sir Cyril and Lady Eileen Fox, who set up the museum of the Welsh Museum of Living, with cottages and all of that. So I can't remember its proper title, but anyway, that's where I sort of grew up on Pennsylvania, and around in Exeter. But I went to 11 different schools because we moved around so much, and that's why I ended up with 2 O-levels.
So how did you manage the 11 schools? Was that 11 addresses, presumably? Yes,
basically. We moved around a lot from staff house to staff house or cottage with no toilet. We did a lot of moving in my childhood.
It's a shame about the O-levels, I guess, but you must have had a very rich childhood growing up experience all the same.
I did, but I went to a wonderful. My parents didn't expect me to pass the 11 plus, but I did. I was promised that I could go to the Royal Ballet School when I failed my 11 plus, and I accidentally passed it. So I didn't go to the ballet school, and I went to the local grammar school, which was a terrible place. And then we moved out to the country, and I went to a lovely co-ed school in the country at Collerton. And we were there while my mother was head teacher of the girls' approved school. But then we moved back again to Exeter, and I had the misfortune to have to return to the school I hated. And that was where I took the O-levels. And of course, in those days, curriculums were different. So I kept swapping. So when I just wasn't ever on the right curriculum to do anything sensible.
Yes, that must be really quite traumatic actually for a child to. Or did you kind of rise above it because you found it was quite fun? Which way round was it?
I made a lot of friends
Hmm.
in different places, and if you had difficulty in one place, you soon didn't have the difficulty anymore because you were somewhere else.
Hmm.
No, I wouldn't call it traumatic. It got confusing at times because when I was at the lovely Collerton Grammar School in the countryside, they knew where I lived at the approved school, and they thought I was some sort of trustee who was let out, trustee as in the prison sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Who was let out on special license to go to school. And it was really fun the day that we had a netball match between the two schools. And I decided to play for the approved school instead of the grammar school. Yeah, no, it was fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had a very clever brother who got a scholarship to Exeter School, which was a public school. And he only ever went to 2 schools. So somehow I got mixed up in I had much more fun than he did anyway.
Did you just have the one brother?
Yes, I did. He was born, well, I was born on his 5th birthday, and he was born on our mother's 28th birthday. So we all shared the same birthday. And he followed my parents into social work, and it was quite fun. My father and my brother sometimes conducted their correspondence through the letter pages of the Times when they were disagreeing with one another, which was really embarrassing for me. But he sadly dropped dead at 46 from heart failure. So that was 30 odd years ago now.
Yes, you still remember that though, the exact.
Well, I have to, because I mean, I actually knew the minute I became older than him, because our birthdays were the same. So on the 5th anniversary of his death, I knew I had become older than my brother, which was a weird experience because he'd been a very big brother. We were very close. And yeah, but he's got 3 lovely kids that are all like him, so he lives on.
Yes.
In fact, his 3rd daughter, is head of ethics for Oxfam. I'm very proud of her. And one of his sons runs a little theatre in the East End of London, and his oldest son works for the occupational therapy department in Greenwich and designs and makes solutions for people in their own homes. So they've got all elements of him.
Yeah. It's a very, very multi-talented family, particularly in the area of social care.
Not me. I never did social work. But my dad he received his PhD 2 days when he was 80. He did a PhD and he went to Birmingham. I took him to Birmingham from Devon in the snow to get his PhD, and that was on Saturday, and on Monday he got up and died. Very happy. He had a very happy end. But PhD was about the history of social work since the day we moved to Devon when I was 5.
Mm-hmm.
So he'd been commissioned to by the University of Birmingham, where he was teaching family law. He'd been commissioned to write this because he'd been running the Children's Officers Association all through that time. So he had all the records. And that was the last job that I did with him, was helping him do that PhD.
Mm. I bet you've got a copy on the shelf or to hand.
Yeah.
What you and your two O levels. What did you decide to do when you left school?
Oh, well, I got sent to the local secretarial college because they had a journalism course running as well. And my dad had aspirations for me to be a journalist.
Mm.
So I did the shorthand and typing and the journalism course. And as luck would have it, I also enjoyed the theatre. So after I left the college, at the end of the year, I'll try and make this sensible. My brother and I were into folk music, and we started a folk song club in Exeter at the Jolly Porter. And I was quite interested in folk music, and I'd made friends with one of the folk singers that we had invited down from London, and he got me a job in London as an assistant stage manager at what was the Prince Charles Theatre, is now the Prince Charles Cinema, off Leicester Square, on a show called Bean Being Bean, and it was Brendan Bean. No, it was Dominic Bean. I can't remember which of the Beans it was. Anyway, it was a folk song show. It didn't last very long, and that got me going with my interest in the theatre. I then came home after that summer of playing around on that, and there was a job in the local paper for a press agency, somebody to work in a press agency called the Devon News Service. So I went along and I got that job, and I spent the next couple of years basically typing copy and reading it over to the national newspapers, because in those days you had to ring them up and read the story over, which was pretty tedious. And somebody at the other end would be typing it. And it was quite difficult at times, because there were times when I didn't like the subject matter and found it difficult to dictate. But what disillusioned me most of all was in July and August. I should start. The agency was taken over by two journalists. One was Rodney Hallworth from the Express, who originally hid Christine Keeler for 3 weeks when that story broke. This was before I knew him, but he had kept her out of the public eye. And the other one was John Owen from the Telegraph, and he was the first person to learn about the Great Train Robbery, because he was so particular in what he did. He had put his business card everywhere you could imagine, including the signal box down the line from where the train robbery took part. So he got to know all of that. These two wanted to semi-retire, so they bought this agency with me in it. And it was just a two-man agency. And they came down to Devon. But it was not really very nice the way some of the stories were put together. And the things that I was asked to do, like interviewing the parents of a young man who had committed suicide, and I just couldn't see. I had to give it up, because I just didn't like the sort of everyday press. It just didn't sit well with me. But it was interesting. I learned a lot from them about journalism and why I didn't want to be a journalist. And then we moved to London, because my dad had got another job. He'd gone back to be children's officer for Barnet, and my mum dutifully followed him. She was actually much cleverer than he was, but you know how it was in those days. So we all moved up to London, and I had a very brief spell working in the British School of Motoring, which didn't teach me anything. And then a job came up in the Mermaid Theatre. So I could go back to the theatre and working there. And I became the production assistant there for about 4 years, I think. And that was wonderful. I really, really loved that. And I could tell you a lot of stories about that, but we haven't got time. And then the pay was terrible. And I applied for a job with an importer, who paid a lot of money, but also expected me to work 24 hours a day. And that didn't last very long, but I managed then to get a job at the open air theatre in Regent's Park, where I was very happy for about 6 years. And then at that, I forgot to mention, I really wanted to be well, I think I did say about the Royal Ballet School, I really wanted to be a dancer, but that didn't happen. But then while I was at the open air theatre, I was going to exercises classes, well, remedial classes run by an ex-ballet dancer, very close to the open air theatre in Regent's Park, just down in Manchester Street. And so this was a German refugee, she was, and she ran one of the very early exercise classes in London. So I went and trained with her part-time for 2 years while I was still at the open air theatre, and then moved back to Devon and set up my own exercise studios, having qualified with Lottie. And for the next 20 years, and I moved back to Tottenham. So I lived in Tottenham twice. So for the next 20 years, I was running the studios, but also doing other sort of freelance stuff and helping my dad, because we bought a house and did a huge farmhouse, and we split it into, my husband was an architect, and we split it into, and so my mum and dad lived next door, and he was still working. He carried on working till he was 80. And he was at that time, as well as lecturing at the University of Birmingham, he was secretary to the National Council of Voluntary Childcare Organisations. So I was working part-time for him at home, and he was still running the Association of Children's Officers. So there was lots of bulletins and things like that to produce. In fact, my earliest recollection of earning money was when I was about 6. And I think, well, my brother would have been 11. And I stuck the stamps on all the letters for all the newsletters that he used to send out for the Association of Children's Officers. But my brother got more money for doing the Roneo machine. And gradually over the years, I progressed and earned more money. But that was our first work experience. So where are we up to? Yeah, living in Devon and helping him. And that was when he started doing his thesis. And I started helping him with that. And then, let's cut this very short. Where do we get to? Yeah, by then, my marriage broke up. So I moved away and met up with somebody else and got married again and had a daughter. And I was living in Torquay, still running exercise studios. By then I had about 4 or 5 of them around the South Coast, and I was training other teachers. And my second husband was a tugboat captain. So we then set up a marine engineering business, which was fun because I liked working with my partners, whoever they happened to be. And we were involved in the building of the marina at Tor Bay, and that was quite a successful business for a couple of years, but things went a bit pear-shaped and I split up from him and had to get a proper job to support my daughter. So for a couple of years I worked through my connection with the marine engineering company, I worked for Dean and Dyball, who were the contractors on the marina. And then my mother died unexpectedly. So I moved back to live with my dad and help him finish off his thesis. And after he died, a local historic house about 5 miles away from the village where we lived needed an estate secretary. So I went to work for them for 10 years. And that involved organizing events in the historic house and managing weddings and things like that. And also the holiday accommodation. There were several cottages and farmhouses and things on the estate. And also the actual farming itself, which was contracted out to, it was rented out to contractors who rented the fields from us, some of the fields, although we did grow crops ourselves. And that was another big disappointment for me because we were using so many chemicals on the farm that it made no sense to me that we were growing crops to get the grants and then we were desiccating them because they weren't worth selling. And it just, none of it made any sense to me. And it was very difficult to work in that sort of environment, but that was only a small part of that job. And after 10 years, my daughter had grown up and had left home, and I needed to sell the cottage I lived in because it was half of it was my dead brother's children's inheritance. And the world was my oyster. And I looked in the Friend, and there was an advert for a warden at this meeting house. And I looked at it, and I had a computer that could Google. It was just the very early days. And I Googled Horfield, which I'd never heard of, and saw that it was within a quarter of an inch of Bishopston, which I had heard of, because one of my favourite shops was in Totnes in Devon, and that was Bishopston Trading Company. And once I went there and they were advertising, and I thought, oh, I'd love to work there, but it was an 80-mile round trip from where I lived in the other part of Devon, so I couldn't go and work there. But then when I saw Bishopston and Horfield so close together, the message was completely clear to me that I would apply for the meeting house, get that job, and then apply to Bishopston Trading Company and get that job, which I did. So that brings us up to date, really. Well, not up to date. That finished 10 years ago. But my other interest, which had been ignited in me years earlier by my dad's cousin, when she introduced me to Ethical Consumer, the magazine, in the days when it was a newspaper format and it was just 2-color printing. And she introduced me to the whole thing of ethical fair trade and everything else. So that's where that came from.
Oh, thank you very much. It's just been so interesting. Thank you. But I was listening along there, listening in for the name of some animal, and I didn't hear one. Did animals play much of a part in your life? Sorry,
Yes. Give me 1 second.
Yes, of course. One can get very dry doing this.
No, I'm going to get a picture. When I was at the open air theatre, first of all, the office was not in the park. It was in Sloane Street. And I worked for a lovely guy called David Conville, who was a theatre impresario. And but when he wanted to build offices in the open air theatre in Regent's Park, so we had a sort of 5-room wooden construction put up at the theatre, because you weren't allowed to have a permanent construction in the royal parks. So it had to be a temporary construction, which it was, which stayed there for about 30 years, I think. And now it's been replaced. But when we moved to the park police came round and said, you can't work here on your own. You have to have a dog. Here's a dog we have prepared earlier. And it was a sort of manic Alsatian who hadn't passed its police exams, basically. And it was a bonkers dog. And I didn't really fancy this dog. I lived in a small flat in Fulham, and it wasn't really going to work with this great big dog. And I told my parents this, and they had some friends who were on holiday on Exmoor. It sounds so bizarre. And they took their dog for a walk. And when they came back, in their boot, they had an estate car, in their boot was another dog. And they'd never seen before. It was a border collie. And they asked everywhere who this dog belonged to, and nobody was owning up to it. So they brought it back to London. But their dog didn't like the new dog, but they heard that I needed a dog. So I got given this beautiful blue merle border collie who took to the job of security dog amazingly well. And I took him to work with me every day. And for half the year, I was working on my own for a lot of the time, and my boss would come and go. But come the summer, there could be 65 people coming into the place every day. And on the first day, when people arrived, he would make them come to the office. He would sort of shepherd them to the office. He wouldn't let them go past until they'd come to the office. And everybody, after the first day, once he'd taken them to the office, he would let them through. How he worked it out, I didn't train him. He just knew who had been there before and who hadn't. And we had a play that required 2 Irish wolfhounds for a hunting scene. Well, as production assistant, I had to look into the costs of all of these, and they were way too expensive because you had to have the dogs and their handlers and all the rest of it. So Barry got the part, and this is the picture I want to show you.
Oh, shall I try and do a screen share, or can people see it quite well like that?
Well, there he is.
I think they can see all right, actually.
Oh, there he is, very proud of himself.
Yes.
In the play. So that was Barry.
Oh, and the love of your life, that one was here. Or did you the dog?
Oh, yeah. In terms of dogs, I've since gone on to, well, yeah, I've since had other dogs, but none of them quite as cantankerous and full of personality as him. He was quite a mean dog. He was lovely to me, but he was quite mean to other people if they crossed him. And then, of course, I'm really a cat person. And I think some of you would have met Marley, who was the security officer for the meeting house. Sadly, he died 3 months ago. But he was the one living here with me, again, a sort of rehomed animal. And he was the one that told me when there were people on the roof taking the lead. He sat up and growled and got really cross that people were on his roof taking his lead. So those are the 2 important animals, really. Although when we had the cottage, we had quite a large garden, and at one time we had 17 animals for my daughter. We had gerbils, we had hamsters, we had dogs, we had cats, we had rabbits and rats. Yes. So, but they sort of came and went.
Yes, as they sadly do. Thank you. That's really interesting to me, because I'm a great animal lover myself. One thing I haven't been asking you as we went along, and I'm sure sorry.
Angela wants to ask something, I think.
Yeah, I do. Sorry, when I first came to Bristol a long time ago, there was a shop called, I'm sure it was Bishopston Trading Company, and it was, I just want to tell everyone, it was the most amazing project. Totally fantastic, because I think, and you'll need to explain if I've got it wrong, there was rolls of material. It was a project, I think, with women, a community in South India, was it, Judi, who grew and wove the cotton and it made its way to the Gloucester Road, I suppose it was, Bishopston Trading Company. And I know when it folded, I couldn't usually buy it. I bought two dresses, organic cotton, because I really think organic is really, really important in the world today. So am I talking about a project you were involved in, Judi?
Yes, you are. I joined them as a sales assistant, and when we didn't fold, we closed it down. As director, there were 4 of us as directors at the end, and the reason it was closed down was that we could no longer get. Caroline Whitwell set it up, not just for women. Because of her work, she'd gone on VSO or something to that part of India when she left university, and she decided to go back and set up cooperatives. We didn't own the work, the business. She set them up as cooperatives and gave them the work and paid them up front in advance, which made it possible for them to buy the cotton. They didn't grow the cotton, they bought the cotton, and then the hand weavers wove it and the dyers dyed it, and the dyers dyed it and then the hand weavers wove it to designs mainly done by Caroline. But eventually, because they were working with one community, one village, KB Cupham, that generation of children in that village all got educated. So they didn't become weavers and dyers and tailors. They went to university and went to work for big international corporations. So there was no longer the artisans there to do the work in the way that Caroline had envisaged. She was she was well past retirement age, and we felt that, the customers all wanted us to carry on, but we couldn't carry on because we didn't have the labour force anymore. And to go and set up another project like that in a different community would have just taken years. So the business was closed, but everybody, we had enough funds to, we were careful. Everybody got redundancy pay, and there was nobody left out in the cold. And quite a bit of money was given to charity as well at the end. So that's what happened to that. But I've got a spare bedroom full of clothes, which is too big for me now, unfortunately. But it was a wonderful project.
Wonderful.
And Judi, you gave a talk in this series in June, I think, last year.
Yes.
So we have Judi's slideshow and talk on Bishopston Trading Company. I'll put a link in the description when this goes up on YouTube. So
that would be great.
People who want to know more can hear more. You look surprised. You've forgotten you'd done it. Anyway,
we remembered.
It's great. It's great talk, and so you can hear more from Judi on the link below.
Thanks, David. Judi, something I was about to ask you was, I completely omitted it, I'm ashamed to say, but at what point in your life were you brought up as a Quaker, or was this something that came to you later?
Right. I think my parents met in the East End of London, and I've never quite worked out what Christchurch Watney Street was, but it was some kind of social activist church run by a guy called St. John Grocer, who had a huge effect on my father in particular. My father grew up in just south of Bristol. His mother was head teacher, and I can never remember which village it was, but she was head teacher of a village school. his father died in the Great War, and my dad went to Bristol Grammar School. But I didn't discover until after his death that the cousin who introduced me to ethical consumer all those years previously was a Quaker. And so it's all a bit back to front. But when I eventually discovered, right, I'm trying to make this short. When he was children's officer and I was growing up, it was his duty to make sure that every child in care went to the church of their faith. So very often on Sundays, I would find myself somewhere other than in the Anglican church that I was brought up in, because he was taking some other child to the church of their faith. So I got a very good look at, well, I got a look at different faiths and how they worked, but none of them was never did we go to a Quaker one. We did everything else, but not Quakers. And it was only after his death, when I went to the funeral of his cousin, who was like a big sister to him, because my father just had a younger brother. And then he had this female cousin who also lived nearby, and they grew up together, and she was older than him. She was the one that became the Quaker. So there's the beginning. That must have influenced him and the way he thought. And my mother was the daughter of a miner and remembers the Jarrow marches and all of that. So she was a sort of raging activist as well. Anyway, they met at Christ Church, Watney Street, and they began their sort of life of social work and things from there. And later on, my brother attended an Exeter Quaker meeting, and I went on a couple of the Aldermaston marches with him and Quakers. And to be honest, at that time, I thought they were incredibly boring, very academic and very up themselves. So I didn't really get involved with Quakers. I was 15, I think, 15, 16, something like that. And that was my first experience with Quakers. And I didn't come round again until I had, when we were living in the country and I was bringing up my daughter, our next door neighbour announced one day that I would drive her to Quaker meeting in nearby Crediton and wait while she was at the meeting and drive her home again. So I thought, oh, I haven't done Quakers before. And I said, well, I'm coming to the meeting with you. And that was when all the jigsaw bits all slotted together. And I began to sort of see, well, I didn't identify it at that time, but gradually what I discovered after that, particularly about the early influence of Quakers on my dad, made sense. And I never looked back. And that was probably about 4 years ago, I think. Sadly, Crediton meeting doesn't exist anymore, but my dear friends that used to be there, I think, well, you might know the Cunninghams. Laura's clerk of Exeter now.
Does that ring a bell for anyone? I'm quite a new Quaker. I think I've only been with the Friends for 5 years, I think. I don't know, losing track of it. Now, I'm just overlooking here. Make sure I didn't miss anything out. I've got quite a lot here that I didn't ask you about school, but you did fill us in quite well about school. And I've got your career path since. What do you think, though? If you look back now, thinking about all the jobs you had, and really, you can't call those jobs really, because they did form a really exciting life and a really exciting career path. And I'm just wondering when you look back at it, what makes you feel most warm and happy? What can you look back on with greatest pleasure in the things you've done in your life?
It's going to sound really cheesy. It's what I'm doing right now and why I continue to do it, because it's got elements of everything. There is there's the thing of being used to working on my own,
Mm.
and being a self-starter, working in small organizations. I was never happy. I mean, there have been things in between, temporary jobs and things that I haven't mentioned. But I always found working in a large organization not a pleasant experience, which was sort of mirrored when I tried to volunteer at Southmead Hospital. It had the same sort of unpleasantness going for it as working in a large corporate company with a lot of, well, anyway, I don't want to be too negative, but I enjoyed being in an organization where I knew everybody and I could see the whole structure and I understood, and you have access to everybody as well, and get to know each other, not just in a work environment. So working here, and yeah, how do I describe this? The opportunities that have been given to me through Quakerism and the work that I've done with wardens around the country, because perhaps you don't know, but I was on Quaker Life Central Committee.
I'm really sorry, I forgot to unplug the phone. I won't be a second. A meeting going on, sorry. I beg your pardon. Sorry.
Yeah, so I've benefited enormously in the work environment, working as a paid employee with Quakers, which led to a lot of unpaid service for Quaker Life, working with other wardens around the country to improve their working conditions, because not everybody, well, I don't know any other area meeting as good as Bristol area meeting in the way it treats its employees. And they are the exemplar. And when I was first appointed to this job, I was sent to the wardenship conference. It was the last one, as it happened, in that form, before I'd even taken up the post. And it was right at the beginning of the sort of internet time. And at that conference, I realized how isolated most wardens are. So in the final plenary, I suggested that we set up a wardenship e-group. And there were quite a few people saying, oh, well, not everybody's got a computer and it's not going to work for everybody. And I said, oh, but it will in time. So I was lucky enough. Oh, here we go again. Before that had happened, I had been on the planning committee for the residential at Exeter University in 2001. And it just so happened that in my village, one of my neighbours managed the computer unit at Exeter University. So I said to my friend Paul, I said, can you please give me an internet cafe at this event that's going to happen for a week in the summer? So he set me up an entire internet cafe, which we could we got some volunteers together, and we were showing friends what was coming, what was in the pipeline, and what the internet was all about. And we had people that would come in every day and have a little session just to sort of learn about the internet, which was really exciting. So, and one of the friends I made there was a guy called Paul Staddon. And the following year, at friend's house, because I then said, can we now have a cafe at friend's house for next year's yearly meeting? And we were given the luggage room, I think, little tiny room anyway. And Paul came in and I said to him, can you please set me up a wardenship e-group? And he did it. He just few clicks and a few this and a bit of that. And he'd set me up with the wardenship e-group. And this was in 2002, a few weeks before I took up my post here. And it's been running ever since. And I'm still the administrator of it. And that was 21 years ago. So through that was what then got me involved with running wardens talking events all around the country for about 7 years, I think. And I've retired from that now, but I'm still on the sort of planning group for other Wardens Talkings. And it's that kind of, that's what I love about this job that I have here, the paid bits and the unpaid bits and everything else. It's helped me to be who I am.
It's very, very exciting. It's wonderful to listen to. Just one more thing. If you had one thing that you still want to do in your life, what would it be? Just one.
Goodness. Only one.
Well, okay, Mum, maybe one or two.
Well, the things I'd really like to do involve travel, and travel's not a good idea, is it? No, I think I'm pretty satisfied with my lot, actually. I don't have any, apart from traveling to places. The trouble is, because you can see all these wonderful places on the internet and on television, you want to go to them. Before we had all these fabulous travel films and things to aspire to, we didn't know they were there, so we didn't want to go. And I can't in all conscience. I'd love to do Route 66. I would love to do an Arctic cruise, or even better still, an Antarctic cruise. That isn't going to happen, but I would love to do that. No, I'm pretty happy with my lot, thank you.
Thank you. Well, can we have any questions people would like to ask? David?
Well, on a point of information, a collection of pigs is a drift or a drove.
Never knew that. That's something else I like doing, learning something every day. Thank you.
I thought I had to drop that in. But you skipped over the Mermaid Theatre. You said there was lots of stories you could tell. So I'd like to hear you say a little bit about your time at the Mermaid Theatre, what you enjoyed most, or what was sauciest, or whatever.
Okay. Well, you know that dear old Bernard Miles was a tyrant, and he was quite a handful to work with. What was it now? There was we used to do Treasure Island every Christmas, and an eminent actor whose name escapes me at the moment. It's probably just as well, because what I'm about to say is probably not going to do it. No, we won't name him. Anyway, he was even more of a tyrant than Bernard was. And we had this parrot called Jack Sprat, who lived permanently in Bernard's office, and also had its own seat when they took Treasure Island to New York. And Jack Sprat was even meaner than Bernard was, and you had to sort of dodge him to get part, and he would forever trying to bite you. But he was also used in Treasure Island to sit on Captain Hook. He was Hook's shoulder. And there was this one actor who was really, really unpleasant. So I'm ashamed to say that we fed X-lax to the parrot. You can imagine what happened after that. And one of my most embarrassing disasters in my working life, when I first got there, I was all keen and enthusiastic, and I decided to get the fire. They had to test the set, all the set. It's a repertory theatre, so we had the fire officers in frequently to test the sets for fireproofness. And I got the order wrong. I ordered the fire test before the design staff had fireproofed the set. And unfortunately, I'd also ordered the servicing of the fire equipment for the same day. The result of this was the fire officer turned up, set fire to the set, which hadn't been fireproofed, And when they went to get the fire extinguisher, they'd all been discharged, ready to be refilled. So there was nothing to put the fire out with. And that was really, really embarrassing. And the only other, and there's a story that sort of mirrors that at the open air theatre, which was hilarious. We were doing The Tempest, and we had lots of pyrotechnics on the stage. It's in the open air, so it's different sets of rules. Anyway, so there were lots of pyrotechnics for the storm scene. And at the open air theatre, we were plagued by bad weather. And we stayed in constant touch with the Met Office, who would tell us exactly when the cloud would come over. So we would alter the running of the play so that the intervals would happen when the rain came down. Anyway, we were in the middle of the storm scene, and the pyrotechnics went off, and you wouldn't believe it. It was in pouring rain, and it set fire to the set in the middle of The Tempest. So it was, you know, it was the most extraordinary storm scene we'd ever had. So yeah, but generally it was a very exciting time working at both places, because I've met some wonderful people and some not very nice people, and I stuck to my rule all the way through: never get involved with an actor, because in order to be an actor and who they are, they have to be so self-involved that they're quite difficult to live with. And I can understand why they have difficult relationships, but I've worked with some smashing people and some not so nice people.
Thank you. Mary, you had your hand up.
Yes, Judi, you were explaining how your father was a children's officer and your mother involved. I wondered, as a growing child, how that impacted you. I mean, you must have been very aware of although he wouldn't have tittle-tattled at home, he must have been very aware at an early age of how some people live.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I don't celebrate Christmas for lots of reasons, one of which is that my Christmas growing up was not like anybody else's, because we would set out in the early dawn, no, even before dawn, and visit every single children's home in Devon on Christmas Day. And this meant that every single children's home would give us Christmas cake, which I hate. every single children's home would make the children wait for their presents until Mr. and Mrs. Brill and their children turned up, and then they would all open their presents, which made me feel really sad, because they almost got overdosed on presents at Christmas by well-meaning people who they never saw for the rest of the year. And I've got two foster sisters and a foster brother who my parents fostered in their once they were sort of in their early teens. But my earliest memory of my learning disabled foster sister, Sylvie, she's 3 years older than me, and she was 10 and I was 7. And it was lunchtime when we arrived at her place in Torquay, and they were all opening their presents, and she saw that I didn't have any presents. So she tried to give me one of hers, and I felt absolutely awful about that. But she and I are still very close. She used to come and stay with me quite often here in Bristol, but she's 81 now and doesn't travel easily. But we Zoom every week, because she goes to a day centre where they set her up with a Zoom connection, and we talk every Tuesday at 2:15, so that you won't ever catch me at 2:15 on a Tuesday. Yeah, it did affect me, but also if I say that cobbler's children had no shoes, there were a lot of times when other children's needs were put before family's needs. Yes, I understand. I always did understand. I never resented it, but I was aware that, like, we didn't have Christmas because we were visiting other I mean, that's an extreme example, but there were lots of times when things like that. And also later on, I quite often would have some runaway teenager sharing my bedroom, because the only way to hold on to them long enough to get the paperwork sorted out was to bring them to our house, take off their clothes and wash their clothes, so they had no clothes to run away in, and things like that. So I got, you know, and I'm still in touch with quite a few of the kids in care who I met through weird circumstances like that.
My daughter was 5 when she defined a social worker as somebody who drives through housing estates ringing a bell and saying, "Does anyone want help?"
Gosh. I don't think it was quite like that, but it sounds like the ice cream van, but no. Yeah.
Anybody else got anything that they'd like to ask?
I've always thought of Totnes as the Brighton of the Southwest, and you were there during your teenage years, weren't you?
What, in Totnes?
No,
I've never lived in Totnes.
well,
I've lived all over. I've lived in, well, you don't want to know where I've lived. I think I've lived in about 10 different places in Topsham. I said I'd lived in twice.
That was it. That's it.
Yeah. Topsham is a very pretty village on the estuary of the Exe.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly an imaginative doer, aren't you?
Absolutely, yes. It's a really impressive story, Judi. Thank you very much indeed for sharing.
I count myself very lucky because although I didn't have a university degree or a single career, I had the freedom to do what I wanted. And I've had some very lucky breaks too, when the opportunities turned up just at the time I needed them. So yes, thank you. It's been a happy life, more or less.
Is there anything more you could say, Judi, about not wanting to miss the opportunity, about being a warden of the Quakers? So observations on Quakers or on the job, anything.
Okay. When I was doing the sessions around the country, and I also did weekend conferences at lovely old Woodbrook too, called Managing Our Meeting Houses. And we used to play a game where we would think of all the different kinds of hirers that the various participants had in their meeting houses. We'd try and do a sort of mind map of hirers of Quaker meeting houses. And then we would put them in order of good to bad. And always fighting for the top 2 places were Quakers and psychoanalysts. Always came in the top 2, either first, second, or second and first, as being the most difficult. And I say that with huge affection and love, because of course, for Quakers, it's their building. So why should they abide by the rules? It's their building, but it's always been the case.
Oh well, look, thank you so much indeed, Judi. I'm sorry you had to have me both as your interviewer and as your introducer. But what I do know for sure is other people will be listening to this with great enjoyment further down the line, thanks to the endeavours of David shortly in putting us on YouTube. Okay. I did warn Judi in advance that this would occur, but Judi, if you do have any concerns, contact David, because he may be able to do a spot of splicing, maybe. Okay.
I don't think I've said anything libelous, have I?
No,
Where
I
that,
Yes, did. No, we were all very good.
no, as long as there's nothing that's going to come back and bite me, I don't mind. And I hope it's not too much of a ramble, but yeah.
No, it
no,
wasn't.
very good, very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The worst would be a vengeful parrot, but I don't think it's going to happen.
No, Jack Sprat is long gone, thank you.
Next week I'm going to have to do this bit as well. Next week, hopefully Ray and I are going to be cheering. However, we want everyone, please, to bring some questions which I think they think will really puzzle the others. Something maybe like just a couple of questions, or maybe as many as 5. Make sure you've got the right answers and challenge whoever else comes to find them separately. And perhaps we ought to say we'll have a ban on looking at our computers while this is taking place. I don't know. So if you could bring some stumping questions next week.
On anything. On anything.
We didn't decide a topic, so I think we just say on anything. Yes, just difficult questions. I mean, all us incredibly brainy people. See if we know the answers.
What does a drover drive?
Oh, not this week, next week.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
we all know the answer to that one, thanks to David.
Okay. So thank you very much indeed. All right.
Yeah. Thank you, Judi.
Thank you for your time.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
John. Bye.